Software cracking dates back to the late 1970s, when wares groups would come together for a few months to crack computer programs, movies, and games. Like, well done Apple II for being one of the first devices to feature software copy protection, but we've got a hacker woman in China who's gonna crack your code.
Well, we're being hacked.
Or at least we think she's a woman. No one really knows. The ware scene, or more commonly known as just the scene, is the deep dark underground world of cracking, a very secretive community that would share cracked media amongst themselves, until some got leaked and cracking became hugely popular. Pretty much everything is being pirated nowadays. We even have people downloading the schematics and 3D printing a Lamborghini. Maybe you would download a car. But let's not get too deep into the scene. We can do that another time. Before every kid got a spec'd out PC to play Roblox, which allows you to play every single game known to man, there were a few ways to play the games you loved without spending the big bucks. That's right, I'm talking about Pizza Hut demo discs. I'm not. But you could either emulate the game on your PC and play games from older generations of consoles which you don't own, or if you did own the console, you could crack it, giving you untapped potential to get access to all the good stuff with the convenience of playing it on the original console. Try playing emulated Wii games on your PC. Yeah, it's not a great experience. Cracking games became huge, with games from the SNES to the PSP having ROMs being released on floppy disks back then and now available on the internet. No, this isn't a video on how to download games for free. But if you guys did want that, then FBI, open up! I mean, downloading ROMs for games you haven't paid for is wrong. But if you guys did want it. FBI, clear right! Before the age of CDs and digital copies, games were played primarily on cartridges except for some plug-and-play TV games. The Commodore 64, an 8-bit computer with a cartridge slot, was one of the most popular examples of cartridge gaming in the 80s, along with Atari, Sega, and Nintendo consoles. Some clever clogs discovered that you could tape the boot line, a metal strip which would connect with the cartridge and take over the computer to load the cartridge. But when it was covered, the game would still load, but now you could save the cartridge on a tape. You no longer needed the cartridge. So people would rent a game from their local Blockbuster, copy the cartridge, and gave the rental back. Due to there not being any fast means of conveying this information, as the internet was in its early stages, it took time for this method to spread, but once it did, rentals started to become obsolete. Skip a few decades, and Nintendo released the best-selling handheld console, the Nintendo DS, which has sold 154 million units to date. It uses cartridges or cards to play its game. If you don't know what the DS is, where have you been? Seriously. This device was revolutionary. Talking about revolutions, there was a game cartridge that was made for the DS that would change playing cracked games on handheld consoles. The R4 cartridge, short for Revolution for DS, was developed by Team R4 in China and released in early 2007. It was a cartridge shaped like a Nintendo DS game cartridge with a micro SD card slot. A 32GB or lower micro SD card could be loaded with the required firmware to run the R4 program and with games that you wanted to play on the DS. The R4 lived up to its name, a true revolution which allowed you to play DS, NES, SNES, and Game Boy games on your DS. GameCube games couldn't be played due to the DS not being powerful enough to run them, but you can't complain. The R4 card expanded the possibilities of the DS, as if the DS didn't get enough game releases. Nintendo DS games and other Nintendo games came with some piracy countermeasures. These anti-piracy measures ensured that pirated versions of the games couldn't be played. There were a variety of measures taken to stop piracy. In Pokemon Black 2, certain player battles would crash the game, and Pokemon wouldn't gain any experience points from battles. Try beating the Elite Four with a level 5 Tipeg. Ace Attorney Investigations 2 replaces all dialogue with Borginian. Chrono Trigger allowed you to play until the first time you travelled back in time, and then it would keep you in an eternal loop. The R4 couldn't care less about any of these anti-piracy measures. Yeah, some games had visual issues and others wouldn't run, but it was only a handful. Nearly all games that were released on the DS console could be played using the R4 without any problems. As the original R4 card gained popularity on a global scale, Nintendo started to catch on. And we know Nintendo's reputation with piracy and copyrighted material. While the R4 card does allow you to store and play games you own on a single micro SD card, removing the inconvenience of having to store and switch many game cartridges, it also makes playing pirated games very easy. In 2007, the year the R4 card came out, Nintendo already started cracking down on R4 distributors and opened legal cases against anyone who distributed, imported, and sold the R4 card. In the period between 2009 and 2017, Nintendo won their cases against R4 cartridge sellers, having them banned in multiple countries around the world, including Japan, UK, France, and many others. But that didn't stop clones of the original R4 being made. Even without all the Nintendo lawsuits, the original R4 was made obsolete pretty much the year after it came out with the release of the DSi. The original cartridge was made for the DS Lite and was not compatible with the new console, and Team R4 didn't release any new products. Clones flooded the market, being released for the new DSi console, but since then they have also been made for the 3DS. However, these cards don't actually let you play 3D games, due to booting the console in strict 2D mode. To play 3D games on the 3DS, you need to download custom firmware. Clones of the R4 have now gained support for the SDHC microSD cards, which wasn't the case with the original R4. Some clones came pre-installed with 200 to 500 games, others kept true to the original R4 and allowed you to play your own ROMs. But the guys who make these clones aren't saints in any sense of the word. The firmware from the developer included what some term a time bomb. After a certain amount of time has passed, the R4 cartridge stops working. Now this could be for a few reasons, mainly so that you would have to buy another R4 cartridge as it now becomes a consumable product. These developers think we're idiots. Avoiding the time bomb is very possible by downloading and loading the R4 using the YS menu firmware. Not only does this stop the R4 cartridge's time bomb, many find the YS menu to have better interface than the standard load menu. I guess that's what you call a win-win. Using game cartridges and micro SD cards are one form of playing cracked games. Another way is to softmod or homebrew your console. Softmodding enables you to overcome the firmware restrictions placed on the console by the developers and install custom firmware, as opposed to hard modding, which requires you to make hardware changes to the console's circuit board. A few popular consoles that can be modded in some way include the original Xbox, 3DS, and PSP. Keeping with the Nintendo theme, the Wii is also soft-moddable. Describing the whole modding process would be pointless. You can just watch a tutorial if you want to homebrew your Wii. But briefly, it requires custom firmware while changing your DNS to start the process. However, the process to homebrew the Wii Mini is different. But why would you buy this thing anyway? It has no internet connectivity, no GameCube support, no SD card slot, and component video output was removed. While softmodding the Wii, you could also download this handy program called USB Loader GX, a convenient way of saving game discs onto a USB, or in my case, an external hard drive, to then boot up and play from there without having to switch discs. But this also meant that a USB or a hard drive could be loaded with cracked game ROMs, and games could be played from there. The PlayStation 2 was also able to be modded in a few different ways. One way was to hard mod the console by soldering a mod chip to the circuit board of the PlayStation, but that can go wrong. Very wrong. This isn't a beginner-friendly process by any means. That's why soft modding is a much easier option. There were a few ways to soft mod the PlayStation 2, such as using the age-old disk swapping method, which included using certain game disks called trigger disks to load homebrew. You could block the lid open sensor, hot swap the disk with the homebrew disk. This required some difficult execution, but it worked on pretty much all models of the PlayStation 2. A more recent method was found last year, using free DVD boot to install free Mech boot onto a PlayStation 2 memory card. The DVD player model needs to be known for this to work, as certain discs will only work on specific models. But it is an easier method of soft-modding the PlayStation 2. A variety of consoles can be soft-modded by using custom firmware to bypass the original firmware, allowing you to play cracked games on cracked consoles. Let's say you don't have the original console to burn discs for or to soft-mod, but you have a PC. Worry not, because your PC can be the console. Enthusiast-developed emulators are your answer. Why does this sound like some crappy infomercial? But crappy infomercial aside, emulators are an easy way of being able to run a console and play its games from your PC. A whole variety of consoles have emulators available to download and use, retro consoles such as the SNES, Dreamcast and Sega Saturn, to more recent consoles such as the GameCube and PlayStation 2. Even more recent consoles have emulators in development. Orbital and GPCS4 are PlayStation 4 emulators that are currently being worked on to be able to play PS4 games on PC, and are making a lot of progress. Both have been shown to run a handful of games, but these games are not playable at the moment. However, for now, newer consoles are challenging to emulate. There have been fake emulators for the PlayStation 4, PCSX4, which shares its name with the PCSX and PCSX2, both well-known emulators for the PlayStation 1 and 2, claims that it can play games in 4K resolution at 60 frames per second, with no visual or technical issues. They even post videos on YouTube showing gameplay on their emulator, which looks as if it has just been captured from the PlayStation Remote Play function. The weirdest thing about this emulator is that when you try to download it, a survey pops up asking you to fill in your personal details. Sounds a lot like one of those "you've won a device" scams online. Just recently, the RPCS3 emulator has shown to run Uncharted Drake's Fortune at 40 frames per second on a Comet Lake i5-10400F with a GTX 1650 Super. A mod is set up, so expect better frame rates with newer CPUs and graphics cards. Besides the obvious problem of fake emulators being available for download that only install viruses onto your computer, emulators are developed by random people in the gaming community. More popular and mainstream consoles have gotten emulators made for them, but sadly not all consoles are created equal. The original Xbox has no emulator, neither does the PlayStation Vita. But that doesn't mean that none are in development, or that there aren't going to be any emulators in the future. It's all about the community, and if people are willing to spend time to build the emulator. But why wait for someone else to build one? If you want to emulate a console that hasn't been emulated yet, get learning and developing yourself. For as long as software has existed, there have been those who've tried and succeeded in cracking it, and it's no different when it comes to games. No matter the format, people have found workarounds to copyright protection, allowing games to be played on cartridges, discs, and emulators. Game developers have been fighting against pirated games for decades, with Nintendo leading the charge, getting the R4 banned in multiple countries, as well as filing multi-million-dollar lawsuits against websites that distribute Nintendo ROMs, such as ROM Universe, Love ROMs, and Love Retro. These websites have been taken down since. While this tug of war will continue to the end of time, cracked games have increased in popularity and accessibility due to the internet. Platforms such as YouTube have provided a way for people to share guides on how to download, set up, and use custom firmware, soft-modding programs, and emulators. All these methods provide a way to play and preserve games from the past conveniently. People will continue to find workarounds to copyrighted material, but it's up to us individually to be responsible for how we use certain tools and what we use them for. As always, stay safe and remember to get good.